Wait, Andrew,
I'm listening.
would you please, cherries on top, marry me?
I, of course, like a lot of people who are probably watching this video, saw the proposal when it first released back in 2009, went to the movie theater to see it with a friend who wasn't a fan of rom-coms and didn't get the hype for the movie, or why I wholeheartedly enjoyed it whilst we were watching it. Looking back at things now, 17 years later, it hit me that she might have had a point. Maybe it's because I find Sandra Bullock as an actress very entertaining and someone I love to watch. And because she takes up such a central stage in this film, I was able to overlook a lot back then. But now that I have done my rewatch 17 years later, it hit me that my friend might have been right after all. The proposal is way worse than I remember and infuriating to boot. Of course, before I start yapping about the proposal, I would first like to express my apologies for the long break. It has been a long while since I last filmed one of these Rom-Com Ganda Tuesday videos. You see, I caught the flu, the nastiest of flus that had me laid out on my bed, barely able to leave it for over 3 weeks. It has been over 3 weeks of lethargy, sustaining on fluids, and sleeping like the dead for several hours at a time. I hate, loathe being ill. So yes, my apologies in that regard. I will of course also like to say thank you, however, to everyone who has reached out to me in concern, and also a big thank you to my lovely patrons and YouTube members whose support have been instrumental in helping me continue to make content, especially since I started doing this full-time at the start of last year, which was the last time I was in paid employment. And a special shout out to Lena, Sherry, and Holly for their extra support. You get all the hearts and kisses too. Mwah. If you too would like to support me on Patreon or become a YouTube member to enjoy certain perks, maybe even get a shout out, the link to do so is in the description bar. Now, for those who are curious about what on earth Rom-Com Ganda Tuesday is, well, it's a weekly video series I have on my channel where I pick a rom-com from the late 80s to the mid 2000s to 2010s. Often it's a rewatch. On rare occasions, it can be a first-time watch. Either way, I watch the film and analyze it to see how well they hold up years later, especially viewing them through my now adult and slightly more critical, maybe a little bit cynical lens. I will say right off the bat that I do enjoy a great rom-com like any other person though. But this particular video series is me being critical in the face of these rom-coms just to see if I really did end up falling for any propaganda that had been innocuously pushed via these films themselves. However, not all the rom-coms I watch will be so judged. For example, You, Me and Tuscany, which I will be making a video on in the coming week or two, and is a rom-com I definitely enjoyed. Also, for those who might be finding this series for the first time, kindly note that I usually split these videos into 3 parts: the intro, which is what you're watching right now, the synopsis of the movie, and finally my thoughts. As such, I will have timestamps put in so you can navigate the video as you so choose. And with that said, the proposal starts with a focus on Margaret Tate, a hard-as-nails editor-in-chief for a major New York City book publishing company, played by Sandra Bullock. Margaret is given big Miranda Priestley vibes, which is interesting considering that it came out 3 years after The Devil Wears Prada and 6 years after the book came out. But anyway, back to the movie. Margaret is giving huge Miranda vibes as it pertains to her work, i.e. she's uber efficient but also an absolute terror that runs a tight ship and doesn't allow for any slackers, even going as far as firing one of the executive who wasn't able to convince an elusive author to go on a talk show, considering that Margaret herself was able to get said author to agree. And she also has our ever capable assistant, Andrew Paxton, played by Ryan Reynolds, who has so molded his entire day to revolve around meeting Margaret's every need and whim that he goes as far as changing his coffee order so that he always has a spare for her just in case. This, however, is where the comparison with Miranda ends, as we soon find out that Margaret really does have a heart of gold underneath all of that, but we'll come to that in a bit. Anyway, Margaret is on a roll, a very busy one that's seen her even ignoring calls from immigration for her appointments. She's Canadian. She keeps putting it off that she will get to it later, but then things come to a head for her, however, when the partners for the publishing firm call her into their office to inform her that her visa has expired and she's to be deported back to Canada immediately. Margaret, unwilling to let things lie and lose her job and the career she's poured her heart and soul and entire life into, immediately announces that she's engaged to be married to Andrew. Andrew, who has no idea why his nightmare of a boss has suddenly decided that they are together, initially attempts to deny this, but when Margaret offers to fast track him to an editor role and allows him the concession of publishing a book he once published, two things that he's always wanted, he capitulates and doesn't back down, even when U.S. immigration agent Mr. Gilpson tries to use the fear of jail time and fines to get Andrew to tell the truth. The two of them then travel to Andrew's hometown in Sitka, Alaska, for his grandmother's birthday, and when they arrive in Alaska, Margaret is stunned to discover that Andrew's family is wealthy, like owns every major store and establishment in Sitka. Wealthy. Of course, Andrew attempts to do that thing that rich kids do where they're all like, I'm not the one who's wealthy, it's my parents who have money. But of course, Margaret side-eyes him as she should. Anyway, Margaret is introduced to Andrew's mother and his grandmother, Grammy, played by the ever-brilliant Betty White. At the welcome home party thrown for Andrew, Margaret meets Ramon as a waiter and Andrew's ex-girlfriend, Gertrude. Meanwhile, we also meet Andrew's father, Joe, who wants Andrew to come back home to Sitka and take over the family business. Plus, he doesn't buy into the whole Andrew and Margaret are in a relationship thing, as he believes Andrew is just using Margaret to get a leg up in his career. All that argument then leads to Andrew informing the crowd of his and Margaret's engagement, to the delight of his mother and his grandmother. The next day, Grammy and Grace, that's Andrew's mother, throw Margaret a bachelorette party where we see Ramon again, this time around, in his role as an exotic dancer. Gertrude was also invited to the party for some reason, and we learn that Andrew had been serious about marrying her, but she had turned him down back when they were younger because, unlike Andrew, she didn't want to leave Sitka and move to New York. In addition to learning this about Andrew, Margaret also discovers that Andrew's parents are at loggerheads with regards Andrew's decision to not take over the family business, and this bit of conflict brings him and Margaret closer. The next morning, Andrew's parents alongside Grammy convinced the duo to get married the very next day, and what then followed was a day of Margaret being taken care of by the other women, and Grammy even has her dress up in her old wedding dress and gives Margaret her family heirloom necklace too. Two things that have Margaret drawing closer to them whilst feeling sad about the family she lost back when she was 16, which was the last time she felt like she had a family. Whilst dealing with all these emotions, Mr. Gilpson shows up. Turns out that he had reached out to Joe about the possible fraud of the marriage being fake in order to help Margaret get a green card. He offers Margaret and Andrew a deal. If they admit that their engagement is fake, then there would be no penalties. But the two deny this and insist that they are absolutely, completely in love. On the day of the wedding, everyone is gathered, including Mr. Gilpson and even Ramon, who is not a waiter or an exotic dancer at this point, but is a wedding officiant about to marry Margaret and Andrew. But at the last moment, Margaret stops the wedding ceremony, saying that she cannot continue to deceive Grace and Grammy, who have accepted her as family, and she admits the truth to the whole crowd, after which she tells a crowing Mr. Gilpson that she is willing to follow him back so that she can pack her stuff and head back to Canada. Andrew is left at the altar and devolves into yet another argument with his father that is cut short when Grammy has a heart attack. They immediately airlift her and start heading to the hospital, but Grammy insists that Andrew and his father make up, and when they do, she reveals that she had faked a heart attack and demands that the pilot turn around to catch Margaret's plane before she leaves. Unfortunately though, they aren't able to make it in time and Margaret leaves, at which point Andrew's family is able to see clearly that Andrew really does love Margaret. Not willing to give up though, he heads to their New York office to find Margaret parking, where he then reveals his feelings for her, after which they kiss, and then they head back over to inform Gilbertson that they are engaged for real this time around, with a post-credit scene showing Gilbertson asking Margaret, Andrew, his parents, and even Ramon increasingly unhinged questions. The end. I think it's important for me to say it outright that the one thing I hate, absolutely loathe, and detest in movies is when the entire premise of it is centered around humbling women. Now, this is a personal pet peeve of mine. I am quite aware that not everybody will feel the same, and that is fine. We're all entitled to our own opinions as long as it's not propagating bigotry and actively causing harm to others. But as I was saying, the one thing I personally cannot stand in a movie is when it is clear that it seeks to humble its female character, its main female character. And the proposal does this to such an astounding degree, but coats it with the veneer of it being a rom-com. So we are meant to laugh, whilst the story itself seems hell-bent on punishing Margaret for being who she is, specifically the type of woman she is in her corporate life. And the ending of the movie reinforces that, but I will get to that part in a bit. Now, I will also not hide the fact that I am a big Betty White fan. Big one. The Golden Girls is my comfort show anytime life gets way too loud and I just want to laugh and have a great time. I will pour myself a glass of wine, hit play, and lose myself in the sheer hilarity of Rose's naivety and Sophia's acerbic, no filter having tongue. God, I love that show. I love Betty White, and I will be the first to admit that her performance as Grammy in this movie, alongside Sandra Bullock's Margaret, were the absolute highlights for me. If there was a super cut of just them, I can watch it over and over again. Margaret's dancing to the beat of "To the window, to the wall, till sweat drips down my balls, till all these bitches crawl." Chef's kiss. Absolutely bonita. What is not bonita is the fact that they had Betty White in a Native American headdress as she performs a ritual to welcome the dawn. Like, they could have just kept the ritual because it's part of pagan practice, but the headdress tipped it into cultural appropriation territory, and it ruined what was otherwise a spectacular scene in the film for me. And before anybody comes in my comment to say, well, it's a sign of the times, the 2000s were like that and nobody knew, blah 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 blah, I get that. It doesn't mean that we cannot retroactively call it out, to point out that whilst the ritual itself can be read as pagan and part of an open practice, and is okay in that regard, the inclusion of the headdress tips it into territory that we should acknowledge and call out, which is what I'm doing. But other than that, 10 over 10 scene, no note. That and Margaret getting on her knees and asking Andrew if he would please, with cherry on top, marry her are the two scenes that are forever seared into my mind with this film. And that is because both sides ultimately hold the conflicting feelings I have about this movie. There's the part of it that I absolutely enjoyed and loved, Grammy and Margaret bonding in a way that you would find utterly unexpected, because based off of our initial perception of Margaret, we do not immediately clock her as the softie who loves banger songs and clearly knows how to party when she wants to. And the part of the movie I did not enjoy, namely the proposal's insistence on humbling Margaret. So let us start with that. The humbling of Margaret Tate. From the very first moment we meet her, the movie is pretty clear on what type of person / character Margaret is meant to be. The bitchy boss that has everyone scared out of their wits. They call her a witch, message themselves so they know to stay out of her crosshairs, and are eager to hear every dastardly thing said about her character, because ultimately she is a hard and demanding boss. But at the same time, we are made to see that whilst Margaret might be a demanding hard ass, she is the exact same way to herself. She is focused, she is driven, she's brilliant, she's incredibly amazing at her job, she's dedicated to her work. And matter of fact, no matter how terrifying the movie tries to play her as with regards her staff's thoughts and perceptions towards her, Margaret Tate is a way softer, kinder version of Miranda Priestley And we love her for that. And so that is why the fact that this film is filled with little moments to cut her down to size, to basically paint this narrative that this woman who is seemingly at the top of the world of her career can be so humbled by circumstances out of her control, systems that are built to bring her down a couple of notches. And she also, at the same time, has to deal with individuals who also aim for that, is meant to be this double whammy of a humbling experience that I found very frustrating to watch, and I could not really root for. Because say what you will about how the situation played out with Bob Spaulding, but it does speak to the inherent sexism within the system that would have Margaret's position be filled not only by a subordinate who loathes her, someone she had fired for his incompetence, but it's the same system that would just appease the status quo with a Bob, rather than even consider having the position be one that is open for application to get the best hands on it. Because say what you will, yes, Margaret did resent that her bosses made the decision to rehire the man she had fired and offer him her position, but it's also because Margaret, who has been shown to be someone who is frightfully good at her job and dedicated to doing it in the most brilliant of ways, is someone who knows that Bob is not qualified for her role. I am certain if she had been informed that yes, her position is terminated as a result of her work visa issues, and as such the board is looking to hire her replacement, and they will be casting a wide net to find someone who can step into her shoes. And oh, by the way, would she mind being a part of, say, the interview process, so that they can be certain that whoever is getting hired is someone that Margaret herself feels would be incredible in the role. I mean, she doesn't have to be a staff member to do that. They can work that into her exit contract, and she can participate in the handing over process whilst in Canada. I'm certain that is a decision she would have at least been okay with. It was an active choice, therefore, to have Bob be the one to take on her role, because it is a move that is predicated on being as humiliating as possible to Margaret, whereby not only is her job the one she worked and sweated and busted her ass for, not only is that job going to someone she is fired for his sheer incompetence in handling a role that is lesser to hers, but it also is meant to subtly hint at the fact that even at her very best, Margaret can be replaced by a second-rate editor who doesn't even have half her skills or a modicum of her work ethics. That was meant to break her. And then we move to yet another systemic issue that at its very core is humbling to anyone caught in its web: immigration. I've always been the type of person who is strongly team fuck borders. They were created as a means and weapon of control by colonizing forces to restrict movement, and also used as a tool to enforce the supremacy of certain regions and countries over the next one. The earth as she is wasn't made for borders. Humans did all that on their own for power and greed and control. And so, of course, a system that enforces that pushes for borders and uses immigration laws to do so, is inherently one that seeks a means to humble anyone that steps out of line and attempts to subvert the status quo. Now, the movie plays this entire bit for laughs. After all, the very premise of it is that Margaret's visa wasn't renewed, and as such she stands to lose her job, a place in the States, and has to move back to Canada. And it is in her attempts to not be forced to do so that she ends up resorting to the trick that is at the very core of the movie. She decides to get married in order to get herself a green card. And whilst it's funny in itself how the concept of the movie plays out, I still get stuck on the horror of it. Imagine having spent years building your career and your life. You have invested everything into it and you've done things right, and because of issues with your visa, you're out. It's of course what is happening in the United States right now with its active anti-immigration policy and the ICE agents being used to enforce that. Quick side note, fuck ICE always. And for those of you who have a little extra to give, consider checking out your local food banks and seeing how you can support your neighbors who are immigrants and whose lives have been upended by the present US administration, which... Now, back to the proposal. Immigration at its core is about humbling the non-citizens within the system and punishing those of them who the system believes have stepped out of line. And we see this with Margaret. She already gets on the wrong foot with Mr. Gilbertson because she acts arrogant, attempts to cut through the system, the line, and wants to get back to her normal life as soon as possible. But the issue is that she doesn't have normalcy as she knows it anymore. In her bid to get it back, though, in comes becomes her agreement with Andrew, whereby he marries her and she gets to stay on and later gets a green card. And Andrew himself gets a position he's always wanted since he started working with her. It's a quid pro quo arrangement when you think about it. And yet, to get that, to have her plans come to fruition, the immigration system in the person of Mr. Gilbertson tries over and over in its bid to trip up Margaret and reveal the truth, which, whilst it would serve its purpose of getting her back on a plane and on her way to Canada, would still be humbling for her, with the end result being, don't try and think you're too smart or that capable to get away with it. And so we have Gilbertson with his snide remarks digging into Margaret and Andrew's supposed love for each other in the hope that something would give. This bit, of course, comes especially into focus in the post-ending credits, where he asks an increasingly amount of unhinged questions of Margaret that seem to hint to this. Him flying over to Alaska to connect with Andrew's father so they can catch Margaret in the lie and bring her down from her position as supposed girlfriend and fiancée of Andrew to the desperate immigrant who is marrying him in order to use him further adds to that. Hell, even Gilbertson's giddy smile when Margaret confesses to the ruse adds to this. Plus the fact that he ends up partnering with Bob, yet another character in the movie who is obviously so down to cut Margaret to size and humiliate her, further adds to this. And then there is the personal, individual moments when the movie is more overt in trying to humble Margaret as a character. Bob's open challenge of her authority and the abuse he proceeds to heap on her in the hearing of all their subordinates falls within this. Her having her go on her knees to ask Andrew to marry her, which was, like I said, is one of the most iconic shots of this movie, still left a bit of a weird taste in my mouth, because yes, I know she's been a bitch, but this is a system where Andrew is also benefiting from the arrangement. Their partnership is one that mutually helps both parties, and so having Margaret go on her knees to beg Andrew, whilst done for comedic purposes, also serves another role in putting her in her place. And then there's the bit with Gertrude. Now, I know the movie ends up turning this on its head into a girl power moment where it's her conversation with Andrew that sees him finally realize his feelings for Margaret and he chases after her, but I still cannot get over the fact that Gertrude, Andrew's ex, who he broke up with because he proposed to her and she said no, is someone that was invited over to the bachelorette party that was being thrown for Margaret. Once again, I get it. The show wants to make full use of its cast, which is why we have the running gag of Ramon, who is convinced himself that he and Margaret have a future together. Not gonna lie, Ramon was a hoot. But yeah, like, you cannot in one breath tell me that Andrew's mother and Grammy are both welcoming of Margaret and are looking forward to them spending their lives together, and at the same time include one of the most tone-deaf actions they could have ever taken if it was still not part of the narrative, trying to make this a humbling experience for Margaret. She doesn't know this person. Gertrude is not a friend. She is a soon-to-be husband's ex-girlfriend who he wanted to actually spend the rest of his life with, and you cannot tell me that Grace and Grammy didn't know this. So in the immortal words of Cardi B, what was the reason? And finally, there's the bit at the end when Andrew hurries over to make his grand declaration to Margaret in front of her now former subordinates, because remember, she's been fired. Now, did I find it swoon worthy that he chased her all the way to the office from the altar? Yes, it's meant to be. And his confession scene, if we can call it that, was funny and also okay. It wasn't utterly brilliant, I'm sorry, but Ryan Reynolds and Sandra Bullock didn't have the steaming hot chemistry that I wish they would have had. The highlight of the proposal for me was more watching Margaret slowly be accepted by the Paxton clan, sans the father, and the gradual incremental way you can see them warm their way into her heart and give her the family that she so desperately craves. It's brilliant, really, the way the movie slowly builds that. And for me, that is the true romance, not whatever was happening with her and Andrew. But anyway, back to the end of the movie. After the conversation and the kiss, there came the line that cemented for me the crux of the storyline. Somewhere, whilst Andrew is kissing Margaret, you hear someone in the crowd say, "Show her who is boss, Andrew," and everyone laughs. And that is such a record scratch moment for me, because whilst it's played off for laughs, and probably would have been too if it was done in real life, it still speaks to the heart of the matter about how society as a whole has this expectation of female bosses being some form of both kind and pure and a living saint. If they aren't, if they are instead what will be characterized as being bitchy, the hope is that they find someone, usually a man, to show them who is boss, tame them in some way so that they end up a more controlled, nicer version of who they are. That comment at the end tries to paint the entire crux of the movie to that line, which is unfair because Margaret at her core is someone who is terrified of emotional vulnerability since she's had to survive on her own since she was a teenager and both her parents passed in an accident, leaving her as an orphan. It cheapened what to me was the emotional beat of the film, not to mention the fact that Andrew was proposing to Margaret again, not because the plan is to help her keep her job, which by the way was the reason for the entire situation in the first place, but so that they can date whilst they are engaged, which is a funny line, I admit, but at the same time I kept thinking, but what about her job though? Like, you all can do long distance, especially for the 1 year that she won't be allowed back into the US, after which she can reapply for her visa and hopefully not forget her appointment next time. There really is no reason for them getting engaged again in order to date. Like, come on, do it for her job, damn it. Anyway, like I said, whilst the proposal did frustrate me in the way it kept trying to humble Margaret, I still enjoyed the bits that had Margaret connecting with the Paxton sans Andrew's father. The scene where she's dressed up in Grammy's wedding dress and receives a family heirloom jewelry brought legit tears to my eyes, for real. Her reluctance to accept it, the clear guilt that she feels because the upcoming marriage is a sham, whilst at the same time she so desperately wants to be a part of this family, hits me in the feels every single time because it is that good. All in all, for me though, the proposal is polarizing in that the bits I enjoyed brought me to tears and the things I didn't made me cry tears of frustration. Ugh. But of course, these are just my thoughts. I would as always love to hear yours. Whether or not you agree with me, please share them in the comments. Like this video, however, if you've watched this far and haven't done so yet but enjoyed anything of what I had to say, share it so others can find my channel as well. Or you can check out my gaming or ASMR channels if they sound like something you might possibly be interested in. I have them both linked in the description bar. I will see you tomorrow with a new video. Until then, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.